Saturday Night Slam Masters, a pro wrestling video game released in arcades in 1993. Known as Muscle Bomber, The Body Explosion in Japan, what a fantastic name. This one was developed by Capcom, the same guys behind the legendary Street Fighter series. Slam Masters would have hit the scene around the same time Capcom was prepping to bring Super Street Fighter 2 to the arcades, so naturally elements of the record-breaking fighting game would find their way into this arcade grappler, and for anyone who enjoyed both fighting games and pro wrestling, this had the potential to be an all-timer. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to play Slam Masters in the arcades because there simply wasn't any cabinets around me locally, and by the time I found out about the game, I'd already moved on and I didn't really feel any desire to go back and play it. I likely emulated a console version for a match here and there, but I never really got stuck into the game to find out what it was all about and if it really was the perfect blend of Street Fighter action mixed with wrestling we'd see on TV. For this video, I played every version I could get my hands on, even the updates and the game's sequel, and honestly I found the characters to be a bit more interesting than the game itself, but let's take a close look at Saturday Night Slam Masters and find out why it's still held in such high regard today. Saturday Night Slam Masters, or Muscle Bomber, was developed for Capcom CPS-1 board, the same board that ran the likes of Street Fighter 2, Final Fight, Ghouls and Ghosts, and Captain Commando. The game itself, set in the same universe as Street Fighter and Final Fight, made obvious by the inclusion of Mike Hager as a playable character and the fact that Ryu, Chun-Li and E-Honda can be seen in the crowd during wrestling matches. Matches take place in the CWA organization, and the story centers around the disappearance of CWA founder and undefeated wrestler Victor Ortega, or as he's known in Japan, Muscle Bomber. Ortega can be seen in the game title screen, but he's not in the original game at all as a playable character, leading to fans apparently speculating that he could be hidden and coming up with wild theories on how to unlock him. With Ortega gone, the 8 wrestling groups that made up the CWA, the Capcom Wrestling Association, held a tournament named the CWA Crush Carnival, and this is the tournament you'll be competing in this game. Manga artist Tetsuo Hara, known for his distinctive work in Fist of the North Star, was brought on to design the grapplers found in the game, and his art style can be seen prominently in the game's promotional flyers and artwork. The art looks absolutely incredible. Before we get stuck into the game itself and how to play Slam Masters, let's take a look at the characters found in the first game, and let's laugh at the bizarre liberties the English team took when localizing the game. Veterans of the game will already know most of this stuff, but it's worth going over for newbies like myself. Viv Slamkovich, known as Alexei Zalazov in Japan. Japanese players understood that this guy trained under Mike Hager alongside his rival Gunlock. English-speaking countries were not privy to this essential information. Instead, he talked about Comrade Zangief from the Street Fighter games after taking a loss in the ring. Viv can also be found in Street Fighter Alpha 2. He's in Ken's stage, having a few drinks with CWA champion Victor Ortega. Gunlock, named Lucky Coat in Japan. He wrestles just like Biff, saying as both men were trained by Big Mike Hager. In the English version of the game implies that Gunlock's related to a famous Street Fighter, that Street Fighter being Guile. Now, things get a bit ridiculous here. Capcom Japan stated Gunlock has nothing to do with Guile, and basically this is the localization team taking extreme liberties and fabricating their own bullshit. But things get bizarre when we look at Street Fighter, the movie, the game, an arcade release that also didn't have anything to do with Capcom in terms of development. In that game there's a character named Blade, and when you complete the game with Blade, you find out that Blade is actually Gunlock, working undercover in Shadowloo to overthrow M. Bison while also helping his brother Guile. Again, this can be seen as a non-canon load of nonsense, seeing as Capcom didn't develop the arcade release of Street Fighter the movie. But wait, there's more. Capcom Japan released official character bios during the release of Street Fighter V. Many of these bios are for characters not even included in the game. Blade is featured on the bios website, and check it out. His height and weight matches that of Gunlock in Saturday Night Slam Masters. So either Capcom Japan embraced the bullshit, or this is just a wild coincidence. There's also a theory that Gunlock is the father of Luke from Street Fighter 5 and 6, but that's a can of worms I'm not going to bother opening. The great Oni named the mysterious Budo in Japan. When Capcom released their arcade stadium games, they offered players real bios based on the Japanese game. It says here that Budo's a mysterious superstar from Japan whose theatrical appearance and style have captivated the world. Sounds awesome, but back in 1993, the jokers who translated Slam Masters said Oni couldn't cut it in Kabuki, so he took up wrestling. That makes his theatrics sound completely second rate, and it also makes it sound like he never wanted to wrestle in the first place. Titanic Tim, given the much better name of Titan the Great in Japan. The Japanese game states he's from Wigan, England, the same place Davey Boy Smith was raised and sometimes built from. He also formed a tag team with Birdie from the first Street Fighter game, but all this gets pushed aside for the English translation, and instead he gets mistaken for Disco Inferno, plus he hates small people. El Stingray, known as El Stinger in Japan, is a Mexican luchador who was apparently based on Mexican wrestler Lizmark. The Japanese game puts El Stinger over like a lucha legend. The English game calls him an ultra macho ladies man with a special move named the Jalapeno Comet. You couldn't make it up. No, actually you could if you were like 5 years old. Mike Hager thankfully didn't get renamed to Michael the Horrible or anything like that, but the Japanese game establishes Mike's appearance in this game as happening before he got elected as Metro City Mayor in the Final Fight games. The English game though calls him the former mayor of Metro City. So yeah, not only were we screwing up the characters, but we're also screwing up the whole game timeline. Alexander the Greater, known as Sheep the Royal in Japan. I'm not sure which name's worse. Clearly inspired by Big Van Vader thanks to his look and entrance attire, Alexander's established as an Australian badass in the Japanese game, while in the English game he's a butcher who enjoys cutting up cute little animals and having barbecues. King Rastamon. In Japan, he's known as Missing IQ Gums. This guy has a resemblance to Blanca from the Street Fighter games. I read somewhere that he's based on an early design for Blanca, but that could be someone just putting two and two together. He has a pet monkey named Freak, who also serves as his manager, and the English game calls his favourite move the Dreadlock, which is actually quite a good name for a move, not gonna lie. He's from the Dominican Republic in the Japanese game, he's from Venice Beach in the English game. The Dread Act was passed in 1979 that prohibited Dominicans from becoming Rastafarians, so I don't know what kind of ganja was being smoked when they came up with King Rastamon. Then there's the two boss characters. First there's Jumbo Flapjack, known as Kamala the Bouncer in the Japanese game. This boy has one massive arm, as you can see from his character sprite. He's the right-hand man of the game's final boss, the Scorpion, known as the Astro in Japan. Astro reminds me a lot of Lasertron, but this dude is not to be messed around with. He kicked my ass multiple times when playing the arcade game, so don't take this boy lightly. He and Jumbo Flapjack are members of the BWA, the group responsible for Victor Ortega's disappearance. So Capcom were presenting NWO takeover storylines long before Eric Bischoff got the idea after touring Japan. More members of the BWA would show up in the game's sequel, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Saturday Night Slam Masters really is easy to play but difficult to master. Obviously, the more time you spend with the game, the better you'll become. We have a 3-button configuration. One button is for your standard strikes, which change depending on the distance from your opponent. You've got a jump button, and you've got a button for pins and other small actions. To lock up with your opponent, you gotta get in close while pressing forward and strike. And this is one of my main gripes with this game. I'd much prefer a single button used for locking up. The problem is, the CPU's cheap as hell, and getting in close enough to grapple's a task in itself, but with practice you'll learn the best angle to come in at your opponent. Each wrestler has different lockup moves, and each wrestler has a special attack they can pull off from a lockup, such as Mike Hager's signature spinning piledriver or Oni's neck-wrecker. Characters also have their own special moves that don't require locking up. For example, Rasta can go feral while swinging his arms around like a madman, or you can pull off the Jalapeno Comet with Stingray. To run, you'll tap a direction twice. You can run and jump while pulling off a strike, or you can stay grounded for a clothesline or similar strike moves. Tap the direction near a turnbuckle and you can go upstairs for diving moves, though you have to press jump and attack when in close distance. There's also baseball slides available, dives over the top rope, you can taunt your opponent on the top rope to give yourself a small buff, and you can also receive a buff after taking a certain amount of consecutive damage. Really, that's all there is to it. What must be emphasized though is that every character plays vastly different from the other, which means your playstyle is going to have to change depending on the character you select. Mike Hager, for example, I thought was a good character for beginners, seeing as he has good reach. He takes a little less damage and he inflicts a good amount of damage himself with his own moves, whereas Stingray plays a lot faster while also having a defensive flip move that will get you out of trouble if you can enter the button command fast enough. Biff and Gunlock serve as your all-rounders. Alexander's slow but more powerful, so there is good variety here, and once you master one character, you can move on to the next. Game modes are limited. You have a standard arcade tournament mode along with a tag team battle royal mode. The tag mode allowed up to 4 players to join in on the action, and yeah, while playing this I couldn't help but think that it would make for a much better multiplayer game in comparison to playing this single player mode. I also felt that it really needed to be played with an arcade stick to get that full experience, because there's a lot of direction button taps during matches along with the usual quarter circle and half circle motions to pull off certain special moves. I just felt like it would be more fun with a stick while bashing buttons to pull off moves. In the standard single player mode, you'll face Jumbo Flapjack followed by the Scorpion at the end of your run, and once you win the CWA Championship, you'll face everyone again on harder difficulty while defending your belt. Flapjack and Scorpion are not selectable in single player mode, however they are available in the tag team battle royal mode. Saturday Night Slam Masters made its way to the home console, so let's take a look at these releases. First up, the one most folks would have owned, I assume, the Super Nintendo release. The colours are muted in comparison to the arcade version, and the character sprites are a lot smaller. But inside the ring, the game plays brilliantly, and I was actually surprised at how faithful this was to the arcade game. It's even more faithful than Capcom's Super Nintendo release of Street Fighter 2. The game also supports the 4-player Team Battle Royale mode if you owned a multi-tap, and if you had an arcade stick at home for your Super Nintendo, then there wouldn't be much reason to play the game in the arcades unless you wanted the prettier graphics. If you want to own the cartridge today, you're gonna have to pay a pretty penny though. eBay prices for the Super Nintendo release are really high, and the same's true for the Sega Genesis or Sega Mega Drive version. This release is quite interesting, and some may actually prefer Slam Masters on Mega Drive as opposed to the Super Nintendo. Again, we have smaller character sprites and the colours are a lot duller than the arcade game, but the action in the ring's absolutely spot on, and I think I might actually prefer the Mega Drive version ever so slightly because the difficulty's been toned down a little bit. It feels like you have a bit more room and a bit more leeway here to perform moves. They say though that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and unfortunately that isn't the case with this game, because the Mega Drive version's completely missing the tag team mode, and that means there's also no 4-player action to be found in this game. Wait a moment though, because Sega got an exclusive mode that could very well persuade you to check out the Genesis version, and that's a deathmatch mode that includes exploding barbed wire. You heard me right, deathmatches in a pro wrestling game. You might be automatically giving Sega the win here, but strangely, this match type's only available in 2-player mode, so there's pros and cons to this release, which makes it hard to pick an overall winner. Growing up, I didn't know anyone who owned a multi-tap for the Super Nintendo, but on the flip side, I can still see why the missing tag team matches from the Genesis version are important to this game overall. Either way, don't go paying the ridiculous prices people are looking for on eBay, and just try both out for yourself using emulators. And if you want the arcade version, it's dirt cheap to purchase on Capcom's Arcade Stadium. Finally, there's the FM Towns version, and I'll never get a chance to talk about this again. The FM Towns, with its stupid name, was a personal computer released in Japan by Fujitsu, intended to run multimedia applications and video games. Fujitsu later released the FM Towns Marty, with its even stupider fucking name, as a consoleized version of the computer, making things a bit cheaper for players. Trying to emulate this was a headache, not because it was hard to set up, but because my PC was having one of those days where cooperation was the absolute last thing on its mind. But I managed to record a few matches, and as you can see, it looks almost arcade perfect. There are a few problems though. The screen real estate has been shrunk down quite a bit, the audience doesn't move around as much, and gameplay overall doesn't feel as on point as the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, but that could also be my fault too, to be honest. Where the FM Towns version wins though is in the sound department. You've got CD quality audio here along with a few updated tracks that sound really good. But let's be honest, you're only going to try this out if you really love Saturday Night Slam Masters. If you want to hear the audio tracks though, a few heroes have uploaded the music to YouTube, so I do recommend checking those out if you've only played the other home ports or the arcade release. An updated version of Slam Masters was released by Capcom, kinda like how Capcom would update Street Fighter 2 with new features and improvements. Known as Muscle Bomber Duo in both Japan and English-speaking regions, the game fixes a key problem I had with the original game, which means I wasn't the only one who had this issue. What I'm talking about is basic grappling, locking up to perform moves. This time Capcom gave players a button to initiate a grapple and it makes a ton of difference. I know there's some purists out there calling me an asshole, but I found Muscle Bomber Duo so much more playable thanks to that one small addition. Each character has been given new moves. Players can now select the same characters to go head to head, kinda like how Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition introduced the same feature. But before you completely dismiss the original game, Muscle Bomber Duo only lets you play tag team matches. I've no idea why Capcom thought this would be a good idea, and I can't imagine why they'd remove such a basic play mode. But this cabinet was pretty much built for 2 to 4 players, so keep that in mind before you go downloading. You can play as a single player in tag team matches, of course, but it would be a much better time playing with friends. A true full sequel was released though on the CPS2 system, known as Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2 in English-speaking countries and Super Muscle Bomber the International Blowout in Japan. This one plays much more like a traditional fighting game. The Japanese flyer explained what happened in the first game and its update. Victor Ortega returned at the very end of the Crash Carnival tournament to reclaim his championship. The BWA then demanded a new tournament with rule changes, such as 2 out of 3 round matches with no pins and no submissions. So the Slam Masters returned to go through another tournament to crown the true CWA champion or something, I don't know. New characters are now available, including BWA members Rip Saber and the Wraith. There's a mysterious new character named the Black Widow. And finally, players can control Victor Ortega. Like any 2D fighter, you're going to get more enjoyment out of this one the more you stick to it. This was one of 5 fighting games that Capcom released between Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Street Fighter Alpha, so I assume it might have got lost a little in between those heavy hitters, and that's why it isn't talked about as much. But going into it as a newbie, I thought it played pretty well, and winning matches does feel rewarding. The button layout has been completely changed to a 5-button configuration: light punch, light kick, heavy punch, heavy kick, and grapple. And as you can see, the over-the-top special moves have been ramped up quite a bit, as have the stage backgrounds and ring setups. This is a fighting game through and through though. It'll require the same amount of patience as any other 2D fighter, and if you go up against someone who has even slightly more experience than you do, then you're gonna get whipped. Still kinda interesting seeing where the series would end up though. All in all, I enjoyed playing the original Slam Masters quite a bit, and the sequel definitely has a ton of potential for those who want to jump into the lab and improve their skills. I couldn't help thinking though that Slam Masters was a product of its time, a great multiplayer game that was way more suited to the arcade as opposed to a game you'd play at home on your own. Whereas Capcom's Street Fighter series gives fans a plethora of media to get lost in, including multiple sequels, spin-offs, story modes in later games, animation, TV shows, Slam Masters has been kinda left to rot a little with their characters making small cameos. So Street Fighter as a whole is just way more accessible than this wrestling game. I do kinda wish I got to experience Slam Masters when I was younger though, so I'd have that nostalgia and eagerness to show and tell. And I suspect many of you will have fond memories of these games and stories from the arcade that make Slam Masters rank highly for you personally. All I can go on is what I played for this video, and yeah, it's good, but I've no attachment to it, unfortunately. I still highly recommend checking it out though. The characters make the game what it is, and there's some great designs here along with some terrible localization, and that localization actually becomes more funny than outright bad. So yeah, Slam Masters, Muscle Bomber Duo, and Ring of Destruction all get a thumbs up from me. Thanks for watching guys, I hope you enjoyed this one, and please take care.